Okay, thank you for joining us in week 6 of world building. We have again lots of material to cover, so let's start. Uh, okay, so let me just share my screen with you. This is the screen I want to share, and I also wanted to transmit sound. Great. So we are in week 6, and today we are going to talk about cultures and introduction to cultures because the lessons from now on about five or six lectures will be about culture, different aspects of culture. Today we are going to make an introduction and we will go into the first aspect of it, the social structure, how a society is structured to create the culture. So let's first see what we did last week first. And last week we talked about sentient species, and we talked about how they should serve a purpose in the game, how they can serve a purpose in the game. Because frankly, if we don't have an intelligent species in the game, it will not be worth playing. Even in the sense that we are playing an animal, we are playing as a player, so that animal will have human level intelligence motives as channeled from us. So it doesn't mean that when we have a fox, it isn't an intelligent animal, because anything we do in the game as a gamer, as a player, transfers our intelligence onto the agent that we are playing with. But we shortly spoke about the purpose. Let me just. Okay. I was worried my microphone wasn't recording there for a moment. So the purpose can be that it can be our player character, it can be an NPC or important character, it can be a lore motive, or it can serve a purpose in the story. But anyway, our intelligent species, sentient species, should have a purpose, and we should design them accordingly, even if they are background images. And the important points that we talked about were obviously their anatomy, because it will directly communicate what they are about to the audience. If they have spikes, they might be an aggressive race, or if you want to create some kind of conflict between their visage and their intention. For example, that's actually a very good example. In movies or games, generally, we see anything that is ugly by human standards. The best example is resembling insects or bugs as evil creatures. That's just generally what's portrayed, because that is what is embedded in our consciousness. But for example, in John Scalzi's Old Man's War, actually, sorry, in the introduction phase of the novel, the people, the recruits, come to a ship, a spaceship, and they are briefed about their current situation, because they are new recruits and they don't know anything about the world that they are inside, about the space world, galactic sci-fi world that they are inside. So the trainer shows them a few alien species as sculptures, and one of them is very beautiful, elegant, almost it's as a space elf, and the other one is an arachnid. And he shows them which one looks more friendly to you, and then he reveals that the insectoid ones are actually a friendly species and they have very good relationships with humanity, and the other elf-like species is hostile and they actually eat humans. So this is a nice, for example, in that novel, that's an interesting wake-up call, both for the characters and for us, the audience, the reader, because it turns the tropes upside down. And we can also do that in the anatomy. You can use things that people are used to as cues, or you can topple them and make them serve as a kind of surprise effect. Now, again, their feeding habits and reproduction is important. What we especially talked about is their means of manipulating the environment, because their sensors and actuators will actually direct their intelligence towards a certain direction. Their kind of communication is also very important. Life cycle, it actually includes these life cycle, sort of, but how long do they live? Do they go through any metamorphosis, or uh, how they care for their young, which we will see very thoroughly today, and their level and direction of intelligence. How intelligent are they? In what areas of intelligence are they more capable than the others? Uh, what is their individual intelligence and what is their collective intelligence? And we talked about how an individual might be intelligent, but a society can have a hive mind reaction. And actually, there is a very interesting inverse example to this. I forgot to give it to you last week. In the Mass Effect trilogy, there is a species called the Geth. It's spelled Geth. Let me just, in case you want to look it up. No, this is the eraser. These guys are a bionic life form. They actually even have a lamp for a head. They are humanoid otherwise. This is a very bad drawing. They are humanoids, but instead of a head, they actually have a flashlight, something like this. There's a light here. So the point is, this is a synthetic species, and they are created by another organic species in that universe, and they rebelled against their masters, and they nearly destroyed them, the whole 9 yards. But the interesting thing is, an individual Geth can only understand or execute very basic commands, rather like an appliance. But when you start putting more of them together, uh, they start to get more intelligent, collectively and individually. So when you face, for example, 10 of them, they start to make better combat decisions individually as well. They start flanking you. They start uh, doing some sort of maneuvers. And when you put a society of them together to the same place, they become a super intelligence. It's as if they have some sort of parallel computing in their minds that can communicate with each other, and they each share the computer power of the mass. So that is a very interesting reverse collective intelligence example worth noting. Uh, and then well, that's actually what we went on. Yes, we didn't go any more further than that. So this week we are going to look at the culture. Uh, but what do we mean when we say culture? So this state from Turkish. Sorry about that. Uh, so in this mean toplumu bir arada tutan genel yapı. This doesn't mean it holds it. It doesn't mean it binds it together. But what it means is it defines that community as a whole. So this is from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. So it says the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of racial, religious, or social group. Also, the characteristic features of everyday existence shared by people in a place or time. The set of this is more a kind of a corporate culture or something, but this is important. The set of values, conventions, or social practices associated with a particular field, activity, or social characteristic. You can think this about communities as well. This is about being cultured. So, when we say culture, we mean everything that defines a community. And you could remember the slide from last week, the timey, wimey, wibbly wobbly stuff. So the culture is truly everything about a community. So in that regard, it is a very complex idea, a very complex concept. And in return, in world building, it is almost impossible to build to our world's level of realism. So what we do is that we manage to do it as much as we require. We do what we need. And when we break it down, we can find other ways as well, but this is the generally accepted breakdown in sociology. So we can see the elements of culture as the social structure, families and caste systems and other ones. We will go into this week. We will talk about social structure in a moment. Language, which is also a sub-part of communication. Customs, this is all the customs actually include the laws as well, because any rule that you have to obey or abide by in a country is part of customs. It can be a written law, or it can be an informal, unwritten law. Art and literature and uh, art and literature is actually very important, both in human species and in any other species that we might want to create, because apart from the entertainment factor or the individual artistic expression factor, art and literature are actually the memory of the society. Because sure, we have, for example, we have written texts, and in literature we also mean literary texts. But when you see a form of art, it actually includes everything that that culture has brought up to that day. So when you look at a painting, for example, from an artist, that is the entire influence of that culture, that history, that civilization on that single person. So it is actually an imprint. Uh, that's why we say these are the rules. So you can say these are the mechanics of the uh, society. For example, social structure and customs are the mechanics. Type of governance is also like that. But art and literature is the memory, and language is, of course, the transmission of information. So, and then we go to type of governance. We will take another lecture for this. The type of governance is, of course, how that society is governed, how it is ruled. Religion and spirituality is also another aspect. We have another week for this as well. And the economic system, uh, since we talked about resources last week, what kind of resources that our species might have access to, or what kind of resources are useful to it, what kind of resources it can utilize, both in terms of energy or in terms of uh, building stuff or in terms of feeding. But that set of resources and their distribution will lead to the emergence of an economic system. And we will look at the economic systems in our history, as in world history. So let me just go on. So when we think about culture, we can see culture in actually two distinct areas. As I said, they are again linked, but we can categorize them into two distinct areas. We can talk about the culture of things, or we can talk about the culture of ideas. So the culture of things obviously include material things. So it manifests itself in architecture, or the cuisine of a culture, or the dresses worn, or the means of transportation, for example, or weapons. And actually, a good example here. Well, I have a nice example here. Let me just see. Do I have it? Oh, it's on a further slide. Sorry. So, and the culture of ideas means to non-tangible things. So it's about the communication, the language, and the symbols implemented in that culture. For example, a symbol in one culture can mean something else entirely in another culture. A very good example is hand gestures. The hand gesture we make here in Turkey to show that a meal is delicious, all fingers brought together and the hand waving up and down, is actually an insult in Italy, for example. So when you go to Italy and someone asks you how the meal is and you do that, let me just uh, stop sharing for a moment. This is the hand gesture I mean. We use this as a means of saying the meal is delicious or something is delicious. But in Italy, it's an insult. So you don't go around and do this to Italian people during a meal. Or there are some very different other symbols as well. Let me just go back to my screen. Uh, and we have ideas and actions, ideas themselves, as a part of culture, because the way people act in a certain culture may not be acceptable for the people of another culture. And this brings us to values, obviously, and we have values as well in that regard. So when we take a small section of all of these, we can there are lots and lots of things to look at actually, but we will take a small sample. So when we look at, for example, architecture, these are all castles. In the loose definition of the term. Castle is for somewhere that you can say that castle is a place that nobility lives, wealthy people live, but that is not actually the case. Because castle has different meanings for the Western culture and the Eastern culture. Now, in Western culture, castle is because of the feudal structure of the West. The East also has it, but the castle is a place where you store your soldiers during a siege. So if your land is invaded, you retract into the castle, you wait it out, or you wait for someone to come and help you. That is how feudalism actually worked. Let me just bring this around and give you an example of it. These are still our geth. I'm getting rid of them. Sorry, geth. So when you have a castle, an enclosed walled space that people cannot get in, this is your safe space in military sense. So in feudalism, this we talked about this last week. After the city-states were transformed into kingdoms, so now I am protecting a land, not just city walls, but I am protecting this entire land. And this, but some army can come and try to invade this land, and they have to occupy this place. And since this is a territory defense after this point on, as long as they occupy here, you cannot operate in this area, mainly the fields. You cannot take the resources. You cannot operate here. But they didn't win either, because you still have a force in here, a force of military power, and if they get loose in their defense of this area, you can just come out and take back the land, for example. So the concept of siege has been invented. They come and take the castle under siege, and the soldiers inside have to endure the time. So they are here, they are still a threat. The soldiers here are still a threat, but they cannot come out because they will be taken down. But these soldiers cannot leave this place either, because they cannot secure this entire area unless this force is dealt with. Now this gives these guys some time to fly a pigeon or a raven or something and call another kingdom to aid. So this siege thing is a defense mechanism. It's a very important defense mechanism for medieval Europe. And this is the result. Very high walled structures that are difficult to get in, that have defensive structures. These parapets are actually defensive so that the archers can shoot from between them, but they won't get shot so easily. They have high towers, so it is possible to see what's going on, if a helping army is coming or not, for example. And obviously they have very high walls so that they cannot be scaled. Now, of course, this all comes down when the cannon is invented, because cannons can effectively take down these walls, and the point of castles diminish. They go away. There's no point in having a castle anymore. So the feudalism can be said, this landlord approach. So I have an army here. The feudalism is basically tımarlı sipahiler in Turkish. I have a land and I have soldiers, so I rule this land by the power the king gave me. I am the lord of this land. So, and the cannon changed that, for example. When the cannon was invented and the fall of Constantinople then became Istanbul, is also an important point in that, because of that regard, because Byzantium had actually very strong walls. So and those walls were taken down by cannons, and the city was taken. So the importance of, for example, in the conquest of Istanbul is important not because Istanbul is conquered, but it is important because feudalism is effectively destroyed at that point. With those power, with the cannons of that power level, you can take down any castle. That is the message that Europe took and understood, and that is why they had to leave slowly that idea. the landlord rules idea, and they had to evolve towards the nationalist idea. So we are all ruling together because we are all French or we are all British, for example. So anyway, we came a long way from the idea of a castle to this place, but in contrast, and I made all this point because I want to go to the east now. This is a Japanese castle, and I do this in quotes because it is not a castle per se in European standards, and this is a Chinese castle, and these are more houses for the nobility. Basically, they are very showy, they are spectacular, and they have a very distinct architectural uh, style in mind, but they don't have very strong walls to scale. They don't have uh, these kind of parapets for defense because even though Japan and China were feudal at the time, they didn't have this kind of territory dispute because especially in terms of Japan, it's a very mountainous region. So you don't have an army coming at you from, you cannot see the army coming at you from 5 miles away, and they cannot surround your castle to take siege anyway because there is no land around you to house all those soldiers. And in terms of China, China has passed those stages a lot earlier than Europe, around 1,000 years earlier. So in China, Chinese culture actually, uh, bravery and heroism are not high in demand. They are not very favorable things. What's favorable in Chinese culture is to be a good citizen, is to be civil. So this is a contrast to what we have from our own culture and what we have in Europe, where bravery is important and heroism is about doing heroic deeds and killing lots of people in battle. In China, a good person, a favorable person, is a good civil servant, is a person that blends well into society, is a person that does their duty well because China and Japan are actually very collectivist cultures. In Europe, individualism is very important, and we see its reflections today as well in United States of America. But in the East and also in the Middle East, collectivism, the state of the community is more important than the state of the individual. So these are not castles to defend from armies. These are castles to house the nobility and to show power. But for example, there are also architectural differences. In Chinese buildings, you see large open inner areas separated from the outside by walls. Now, in Japanese architecture, you you don't have that much separation from the outside, so the walls are thin like paper or cloth, but the inside of the castle is separated into small rooms. So Japanese created the idea of personal space. Uh, but the Chinese structures don't have that kind of thing, for example. So this is an interesting approach to how two different cultures, Eastern culture in general and Eastern culture in general and Western culture approach uh, the things, approach architecture, and also how different aspects change. For example, this is a Spanish castle, as you can see the flag, and this is an English castle. And you can also note the differences in style here. The British castles are very rectangular, and Spanish castles have round features to them with lots of walls as well. This is actually, I think this is a Normandy. It's called a Normand castle or something like that. I don't really remember, but it doesn't matter either. So, how do we see this in games? For example, this is from Daggerfall, one of my favorite games of all time, and this is the castle of Daggerfall in Daggerfall, the city of Daggerfall, and this is the palace in Sentinel. Now, in Daggerfall, Sentinel is a relatively southern country in that map, and it is a desert area, and it is loosely based on some sort of Middle Eastern culture. There are red guards there. Red guards are basically black people. So, what Bethesda did in Daggerfall was to base Sentinel and surroundings to a desert culture, Middle Eastern desert culture of sorts, and to base the northern countries to the European culture. So you can see the differences here. You have almost have parapets. We don't have parapets here, but we have a dome, and you can very easily define this as some kind of Middle Eastern architecture. But for example, you don't have very high parapets because that is a representation of Islam specifically, and they don't have Islam in this world. So if they make this like a mosque and put high parapets around, they would have to explain in some way or fashion why those high towers were around that. What was the purpose? Because in our culture, it has a very important and definitive and very well known uh, reason, and it has other implications in the world culture as well. Based on the way certain cultures view Islam, they can interpret a parapet very differently, and that can also be a controversial topic in certain areas in the world. So they chose, for example, not to duplicate that aspect of Islamic architecture, but they adopted the dome structure, for example. And in here, you see a typical castle, that any palace that could be. But an interesting aspect, for example, is the columns here. You cannot see the detail, of course, but these are basically Hellenistic columns you would see in Greek structures. And when you look at it in this kind of architecture, it doesn't seem right, because Europe didn't have an Hellenistic architecture, and it still doesn't, because they are separate cultures actually. But for example, in Turkey, we have lots of structures that are modern in architecture, but also employ these kind of columns. And we don't know why, because they want to be flashy, for example, because the architect thought they were cool, or maybe, or quite possibly, because they mean knowledge and satisfaction. Sorry, sophistication. What is satisfaction? Let me just show you an example if I can find it. This is Bilfen, a school in a, a chain of schools in Turkey. So what you see is that they have a characteristic in their building. These are Hellenistic columns, and when you look at the building, it doesn't have any function there, or it doesn't have any thing to serve there, but their buildings all have it, because it conveys the emotion that this is a place of knowledge. And actually, there's a lot to say about that, about Bilfen, but I won't go into that because it's not the topic at all. But they give the sense of sophistication and knowledge to people who send their children to this school. And even though it doesn't have any function, or it doesn't even look good in this context, it is there because of this reason. So, okay. After the mini rant about architecture in Turkey, we go back to our subject. So, the culture also shows itself in forms of dresses, and this is very, very important in the dresses, because it is actually how our species expresses itself and its culture through itself. So, buildings are the things that we go inside, but dresses are the things that we wear. This is, for example, this is a Hindu wedding, and this is how the Hindu people perceive themselves and also project themselves onto other people and other cultures. That is a very strong thing. And in terms of games, of course, in terms of character design, it will also be very important. Character design has lots of details and lots of aspects to be considered, and this is one of it. This is a Japanese wedding, and this is a German wedding. I specifically went into wedding dresses as an example because they are very different, generally different from daily life dresses, but they have very strong symbols of the culture. For example, I have other examples here. Here, this is an Indian wedding, a Hindu wedding again, and you can see the basically reddish color themes here, and the gold. It's probably to signify the wealth. Uh, and you see here, for example, Nigerian bride. Let's see, uh, 250 ethnic groups and over 500 languages. It's a very diverse place. So they often wear brightly colored wedding clothes and a Nigerian head tie. Of course, hats are also important in lots of cultures, because as we spoke last week, our heads is basically how we perceive our position. We are the head in our minds because all our sensors are there, our brain is there. The operating center is the brain, and so the head is important, thus the head. So, for example, traditional wedding in Ghana, and this is very interesting because this is colorful. It conveys a different motion and emotion, but it also says each family has its own cloth pattern. This is very interesting because this means uh, clothes as a material is very important there. And you would, if they have lots of access to lots of cotton and stuff, it would be normal. But it shows that clothing and embroidery has a place in the culture, and it actually is used to signify. For example, maybe this design pattern is for this guy's family, and this pattern is for the girl's family. I don't know, but it shows us something about the culture. Now, for example, this is a Mongolian bride, and you again see bright cultures, and you see the very big hat, uh, and there's not much else to say about that. Uh, Deal pattern clothing. Okay, this is, for example, Japanese wedding, and you see a simpler design here, for example, and it might reflect the fact that Japanese are very practical people. So it doesn't mean they don't show off, they do show off, but they do it in the sense they do their work. For example, in sword arts in Japan or the martial arts, it's all about efficiency. So they try to perfect what they do and see the elegance through that. They don't try to do showy moves, for example. They do the most efficient move and it becomes elegant and beautiful. And maybe we can see this in their wedding dresses as well, which there's a nice information here. The bride often wears pure white kimono for the formal ceremony, which symbolizes purity and maidenhood. After the ceremony, the bride may then change into a red kimono to symbolize good luck. So red in Eastern cultures mean good luck, for example. And this is a bride from Kazakhstan. And the interesting thing here, she also has a hat here, and this hat is actually prepared, or they begin its preparation, the family, long before the bride comes of age, the age of marriage, or she marries. So this is a ritual. This hat is a preparation for the girl to marry throughout her life. So then you can see that marriage is important in this society, maybe more important than other societies, or it's an important for a woman in the society, for example. So this is a Scottish wedding, and we all this is very popular in popular culture. The kilt, it's one of the few instances where men wear skirts, and it's traditional. But the interesting thing here is after the ceremony, the bride take, and they also have patterns, family clan colors, and the bride wears a shawl. It writes here as well, a shawl of his husband's clan colors to show that she married into that clan. And this is about Ukrainian Carpathians, very colorful, full of dancing, games, and jokes. Maybe not so much in these days, unfortunately. And for example, this is a Romanian bride, and it's a very different uh, type of clothing. It's more of like a dancing clothing, looks like, or probably these beads have a meaning because you wouldn't put this much jewelry on you, even if it's just beads, for no reason. And this is interesting, Kosovo and Macedonia, Gora region. For example, the bride has face paintings, and this should this should take a lot of time to do, a lot of time to prepare, a lot of effort to prepare. So it probably, these symbols signify something because you don't go through this much effort just for the show of it, for example. It has to have a cultural significance. And this is what I mean when art is the memory, for example, of the culture, because it just might be that all of these points mean a different thing, or their colors may mean a different thing, or maybe if I'm just uh, talking out of pure imagination here, I don't know anything about this face paint, but these colors might signify different things, for example, or the way this is drawn might mean something different. And this is a Chinese wedding, red again for the good luck, and they are very happy. This is a Yakan bride, again face painting. Uh, Traditional weddings usually consist of two ceremonies, an Islamic one and an older pre-Islamic ritual, for example. Interesting. Hungary, again, closer to our culture. Hungary is very, actually, they are from Han Turks, kind of. So, Hungarian culture and Turkish culture are very close together. She often wears many underskirts as well as an elaborate headdress with wheat woven into it. For example, wheat in many cultures symbolizes prosperity. So, that might be the reason why. Norway, for example, and this looks very much like something you would wear in daily life as well, except for the West maybe. Peruvian bride, again, you see bright colors, and in all these images, you see different colors used together. For example, a graphic designer might say, "Oh, these colors don't go together," but in these cultures, they mean something together. So, when we look from another perspective, we can see how colors or how shapes, how forms mean something different in every culture. So this was an example for the dresses. And just let me just go. Now we can go. No, 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 no. Okay, I thought I accidentally erased the slide again. So we can go into every single one of these, but it would take days to go through this stuff. So we just went into architecture and dresses, but you can do some research on cuisine, means of transportation, weapons, pottery, jewelry, anything that is related to things, tangible things, and you can see the aspects of culture in each and every one of them. They have, they each have experts of their own, and they even have experts of certain periods for architecture, certain periods for weapons, for example. So it's a vast area to be explored. So when we come to the structure of a culture, how is it structured? Now the culture consists. Oh, I did actually erase that. Sorry. Okay. The structure consists of these things. Let's say. So we have norms, we have consequences or repercussions. Sorry, this is badly written. I should have written repercussions or sanctions. Values and communication. These are the things that you can break down how a culture is formed. So, in norms, we have the norms basically mean rules. So, we have formal ones. These are termed mores. These are sociological terms, by the way. Formal rules are mores, and informal rules are folkways. And then, of course, there's taboo. Let me just go through this if we will go there again. Okay, we will. So I don't know. I have a slide about this, so I don't have to go into this in detail here. So we have consequences about our actions in a social structure. We can have reward, or we can have some sort of punishment, and there are values that uh, these social structures go by. And then we have communication, means of communication that create the culture. And I think the slides are mixed up here. We will go into communication first, but that's okay. So, for example, we can have verbal communication, non-verbal communication in terms of facial gestures or gestures, and we can have written communication, we can have visual communication, and we can have symbolic communication. So, if we talk about each of these, how these manifest themselves inside a culture, in verbal communication, for example, we use our voices. Now, I am talking about what happens on Earth specifically because that's what we have. But again, as we talked about it last week, the way our species uh, perceives the world and manipulates the world will change their way of communication as well. But in our world, we use the pitch of our voice, the how thin or not thin, of course, how high pitch or low pitch our voice is. So, for example, it can be a very low pitch voice or a very high pitch voice, something like that. I'm not a voice actor, sorry about that. But we have the tone or the mood of our verbal communication, and of course, we have the content. So, when you think about communication theory, in electronics or other stuff, you care about the content being transmitted properly. That is what you care about. But in social structures, the pitch and tone actually matter a lot too. For example, in Mandarin Chinese, there are different types of uh, stressing out a word. You can say something in the you can stress it out in the beginning, or in the middle, or in the end. So you can say hae, or you can say hae. They are both high, but you can pitch at the end or you can pitch at the beginning. And the thing is, they mean entirely different things. So in Chinese, that pitch, the position of the pitch, the position of the verbal stress is very important, because when you're calling out to your mom, you want to say mom, but you miss this and you say horse instead. And you can guess that it creates some kind of problems for you. But for example, in a language like Japanese, the pitch and tone is basically non-existent. They just go da 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 da, because it's a syllabic thing. And we will go into these next week when we talk about languages. But for example, in Turkish, we have different pitch based on what that word serves as. For example, take the word kurtuluş. If it's a place, you say kurtuluş. But if it's about saving someone from something, you say kurtuluş. So in kurtuluş, the pitch, the stress is at the end. In kurtuluş, the location, the stress is at the beginning of the first syllable. Also, there is another thing in Turkish and English both. The word that you stress on is the one that you are trying to put emphasis on. So are you going today? When I say that, I'm asking you if it is today that you are going. But if I say, are you going today? So it's about the action. So when I put in the stress is important. Now, in nonverbal communication, we have, of course, facial gestures. So when I say something verbally, the content might say, for example, that I agree with something, but my facial gesture may say something otherwise. This might create the conflict that I am lying, or it might be indicating sarcasm on my part. And our body posture is also important. And I want to make a very short public announcement here. 90% of the books that you see on the shelves about body language are total nonsense. So they say things like, if a person is standing and his or her feet are towards you, they are interested in you. Or if his other feet is over that way, they don't want to talk to you, or something like that. These are all marketing tactics to sell the books to business people. But there is actually some truth to that, and it is actually very simple. The way your body faces does show interest in the direction that you are interested. The way you put your hands, the place you put your hands, do mean you feel certain something. For example, it is known that holding the hair at the back of your head means that you are, oh, sorry. This guy is holding me at the back of his head. This means that he is suppressing his urge to be violent, but it doesn't mean he wants to attack someone. That person might be doing it unintentionally, for example. Maybe they don't know. So any book that says if someone is scratching nose, they are lying, that is total, utter nonsense. But there's a science to it. There's actually a book that goes into the science of it, but it's written by a French person, Philippe Truchet. I have seen it printed in Turkish only once, and I bought 2 copies, but I couldn't see that. I will give you the name of the book later on, but it's a very enlightening book in that regard. It doesn't have any, how to say this, it doesn't have any blueprints to read body language, but it shows the cues as to what they might mean. Well, anyway, again, straying from the topic here, but gestures and touching someone may mean very different things. So you can touch someone on the shoulder by putting your hand to the side of the shoulder, or putting your hand to the top of the shoulder. Now, the side of the shoulder is a friendly gesture, but the top of the shoulder tries to assert dominance in the way that I know a little bit more than you. So I am in command here. these kind of things. And these all come actually from our animal origins. When you observe dogs or cats, you see their body language very clearly because they don't have another layer of intelligence on top of that. Their body language is actually their intelligence. So when they sniff each other or when they do a playful move, you see the intention immediately. It is not that clear with humans or maybe other intelligent species, and it creates layers of complexity. Eye contact is also important. If you make eye contact when you say something, if you don't, and again, I emphasize, it doesn't mean that someone is lying if they don't make eye contact. It might be something different entirely. After that, we come to written communication. And in written communication, the structure, how we structure our text, which we more and more degrade in the age of internet. And it's not, well, I'm talking about the opening, the body, and the ending segments of a structure of a text. But in today's world, the texts are very small, and anything more than a paragraph, anything more than 3 sentences is actually called a wall of text and something that people don't want to read. So that structure may have gone bonkers today, but it doesn't have to be so in our world or in our culture. And clarity is something different. It is how well we use the words to tell what we mean. And content is, of course, the content. In terms of clarity, for example, there is a very nice example. There is something called Legalese. Maybe you've heard of it. It is uh, it comes from the word legal, and it means legal speak, actually. It is the profession of uh, deliberately making some sentence more complicated so people cannot understand it. It is something the priests did a lot with their speeches before the Renaissance, and now the legal people and sometimes medical people did because it locks the information away from the people who cannot understand this kind of language. So it's a very complex jargon of words that are thrown around but mean a very simple thing. But it is done so that you actually need a lawyer in the legal system. It's also so in Turkish. They use the old language, the Ottoman Turkish language, for example, and it's also so in English. They use Latin verbs and other things, Latin words. So legally speak, for example, on intentionally obfuscates clarity so that the content is not readily available to everyone, so that their profession might have some sort of power over society. Now, when we talk about visual communication, we talk about, for example, the movies or the visual part of the movies, video games, very important, paintings in the classical sense, or any other small painting stuff. So the content is again there, but it is not readily understandable like written because in here it is pure information. It goes directly into your brain through symbols, letters, and you understand the word and the concept that it means. But in visual communication, you have to interpret it. When you look at a painting of Picasso, for example, you have to interpret what he meant by the triangle over there. Maybe he didn't even mean anything by it. That triangle is just there, but maybe it means something. So uh, the mood is also important, and the medium. The medium meaning it can be a video, it can be a painting, it can be even a scribble on a pot that you find in an archaeological dig. Uh, and then there are symbols, of course, and symbolism is very strong in human cultures. So we have, for example, they're basic. When I do this, you will all have, yes, yes, please. Uh, yeah, well, they are actually combined mediums because they include verbal or audio communication and they include visual communication. And as I said in the beginning of the lecture, these are all mishmashed stuff. we categorize them only so that we can understand them better. So when you look at YouTube or when you look at Instagram, if you categorize it as from these, it's a visual verbal uh, medium and content, but of course there are humans inside it, so it has non-verbal implications as well, because there's someone speaking in that video and their posture, facial gestures speak to you as if they are in front of you. And also it includes videos. So they are actually combined or complex communication styles, let's say. And that is, but when you say YouTube and Instagram, basically they are the same, because they both produce the same kind of effect. You watch something, a video from a screen, but just the fact that you are watching them from a screen and not listening from a person in front of you, for example, changes the entire context, because you cannot say anything back. But when you are, for example, when you go into the VR area, you have you well, hypothetically, you have that person in front of you, but that person is not really that person and an avatar. For example, there are lots of discussions about harassment in VR, and I think it's a very legitimate concern, because some people think it's not a big issue. They are just virtual hands. Why do you care where I groped you? But when you think about the personal space aspect, VR is a space, and you occupy that space, and thus you have in your mind the same personal space rules applying to you. And when someone comes and violates it, even if they cannot touch you physically, you see that. It doesn't just have to be sexual harassment, by the way. But when someone comes into your space in VR, it is still your space. It doesn't matter whether they can touch you or not. They are in your space. So in our modern world, these definitions are all blurred, and they are all together. They are always blurred because written text changes context very quickly when someone reads it differently. So there is content there, the structure is there, the clarity is there, but if someone is reading it to you and they read it in a certain way, that changes the entire context of the message. So, as I said, these are categorized this way so we can understand them better. They are not actually a way of structuring these. So when we design our communication, for example, in our society, we have to factor all of these in, and it is a very, very difficult task to do. So we divide them down, and we try to see how it is, how it applies. And for example, in some sci-fi worlds, like Star Wars, communication is instant, and no matter how far away you are at the other part of the galaxy, and you can just send a hologram to your Jedi Master and talk about that clone army. And it isn't explained how it is possible, because do you do it by hyperspace relays? Do you do it by the merit of the Force? How do you do that? They don't explain it. But for example, in Dune, you actually have to write a message, put it on a ship, and send it away, because there is no other way to reach the other part of the galaxy except for being in a ship. Messages cannot travel that long, that far, that fast, for example. And that changes the entire context of communication in that universe. But then again, in Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, the main character actually discovers a way to send a message through space instantaneously, even to light years away. And that is the main conflict that drives its relationship with the world. So the main character is a physicist, for example, there, and he discovers this, but the society he lives in, well, I don't want to spoil the book for you. It's an excellent book. It's a wonderful world building book, except for one minor thing that I don't like, but that I will just make that pass. So in Dispossessed, Shevek discovers this, and this changes his entire relationship with himself or with the society around him. And this is something that can change the entire human society in that setting, because now, before, you had to transfer a message at the speed of light, and it would take years to go somewhere or weeks to go to some colony, and now you can do it instantly. That is something that would change any society, just like what we have. 50 years ago, we had to send letters It's just 50 years ago. When you consider almost 5 or 10,000 years of human civilization, this happened instantaneously. This, you think YouTube or Instagram, this transmitting of information this fast has happened almost overnight. That is why, for example, this is a wonderful idea about world building. That is why the legal systems cannot react to it as fast, because the legal systems, the banking systems, all these structures have been built in millennia, in 2,000 years or so. The banking system is almost 1,000 years old. Governance is almost 3,000 years old. Law systems, the legal systems. But this technology has come about 30 years ago, and this thing called Facebook or social media has been about only 10 years, for 10 years, and this entire flow of information, user information, cyberspace, all these things, our human society in all around the world cannot react to it. Some try to control it like China does, and some try to set it free like US does, but it explodes in their face in forms of Facebook messing with the elections and stuff. But that is what you said is actually a wonderful point in terms of world building. In our world building, technology progressed really fast, and the other aspects of the culture cannot keep up with it. So, who are speaking the language of gods? I missed that. Sorry, I missed the chat. Batıkan said they are speaking the language of gods, but I don't know who they are. So I missed that. So, oh, okay. Okay. So when we continue on to symbols, I was drawing, as you might guess, a cross here. And we know what this means all around the world. Okay, it is a symbol of Christianity, for example. But of course, for Christians, it might mean something very more nuanced, for example, because Christianity has lots of different sects, and for each of them, the cross might have a different meaning. Or, for example, for Islam, it is generally seen as the crescent, even though it's not the, in quotes, official symbol, but it is seen as so. So, but there are other symbols as well. For example, in popular culture, or jokingly, when you see a triangle, you think of a force that tries to rule the world from behind the curtains. It's attributed to Illuminati, and there are even jokes about that. Whenever you see a triangle in an image, you point it out and you say, "Oh, Illuminati confirmed," or something like that. So this symbolism, or for example, this is actually a bitter but very good example. This swastika is actually a pagan symbol. So it's actually a symbol that it was present. Is it pagan or Hindu? I don't actually remember. I'm sorry about that. I should have looked into it before the lecture. But this is a symbol that was actually present in the world culture before Nazi Germany came by. But they took it and they turned it into something that should be avoided by their actions. So this now symbolizes that era of death and destruction in Europe or around the world, because they started it and they led with this symbol. So this symbol changed meanings drastically. And in today's world, you cannot, for example, wear this, let's say, and then try to defend yourself by saying, but this is a pagan symbol. I'm wearing it because it's a pagan symbol. No, it has changed its meaning now. And anywhere in the civilized world, it has a new meaning. And if you don't take that into consideration, there will be consequences for you. And when we, for example, combine all of these, let me just check my slides. Okay. When you combine all of these, we arrive at things of means of communication like the social media, as you pointed out. And now we come to norms. So norms can be formal and informal, or they can be taboos. They are basically the rules of the society. And formal ones are deemed necessary for the welfare of the community. These are the ones that you cannot ignore. These are the ones that help the society run. And it creates a problem if you break them, which basically means they are written laws. Let me just take something here. Okay, so for example, theft is something that shouldn't be done, and it is a formal rule because it infringes on material wealth, for example. And if you have a society that really values material wealth, stealing would be very wrong for that community. But if you have a society where you don't own anything actually, you wouldn't maybe be concerned that much about theft because it wasn't yours in the first place. Someone just took it and started to use it, for example. And there's again a wonderful example of this in Dispossessed of Le Guin. In that world, in that part of the world, our heroes, protagonists part of the world, the society does not have any possessions. Everyone owns everything. And the protagonist is given a blanket by their friends to he has a mate, and they have a very interesting relationship because in that world also relationships are not considered to be mandatory with someone. So basically all relationships are open in that society. And these two people have a dedication to each other, not out of social necessity, but because of their care for each other. And you see that in that society, people admire this because they cannot have it like them, because it's not something that you enforce. You cannot. They have this relationship coming from within, not because someone told them to get married, for example. And they bring them an orange blanket. Someone brings them a present, an orange blanket as a present, but nobody has any concept of possession there. So that blanket for them, it's something that they love, but it creates a very strong, very interesting emotion for them because they know it is not theirs, but they have they think of it as theirs, but the concept of theirs is very alien, something like that. But in that kind of community, you cannot talk about theft, for example. So that kind of community would not have that as a law. Now, moving on, informal rules, folkways, are the rules in daily life. So, for example, when you see someone coming, you hold the door open and you let them pass because you opened the door already and you are being kind by letting them pass. Nothing happens if you break that law. You are not obliged to do it, or maybe helping an elderly carry his or her belongings, for example, groceries. These are not the things that will interrupt the social operation if you don't abide by them, but they are generally about being a good person in that society. And we have taboos, for example. Taboos are things that in any way uh, are anyway seen as unbreakable rules. And this is very interesting because when you first think of something as a taboo, something that should never be done, you would say it would be murdering someone, for example. But murder, not using murder, is a moray, not a taboo, because we murder people all the time. There are wars, there are crimes, and you punish them. This is done all the time as part of our nature. So it is not actually a taboo. It is a moray. You don't kill someone is basically a law in every country in the world. You cannot go around it. What's a taboo is, for example, a very good example is incest. So that, for example, incest, in terms of incest, I once remember a sociology professor speaking, listened to a sociology professor speaking, and he said that incest is a taboo because it disrupts the social hierarchy. So, for example, now this is an unpleasant topic, and I apologize about that, but this is something worth going into. You have some kind of social hierarchy. So you have a parent and you have children, and now in socially we will go into this. Parent is above the level of the children in generation, in terms of respect, in terms of social structure. But when you mix this up, when a parent has an intercourse or relationship with one of their children, this upsets the hierarchy. So you don't know, because a relationship is a very strong bond, and it creates a dynamic for the people involved in it, a power dynamic, so to speak. And this power dynamic would make it very ambiguous as who has the authority or who has the control here. Because normally, in a normal uh, family relationship, the one higher up in the hierarchy would have the authority or have the respect or have the power. But when you again engage in that kind of relationship, you lose that clear cut understanding of it. For example, that's one way to look at it. Apart from the biological way that it creates offspring that is unhealthy, genetic flaws, for example. And in that regard, but when you think about it, incest, in some level, was not that kind of a taboo in the past. We still see marriages within family in the world today, especially in rural areas. But for example, in today's world, in some rural areas, marrying cousins can be common, and it still creates problematic relationships and problematic offspring. But that's not the case. That's not the point. In hundreds of years before, especially in Europe, siblings marrying was also common, especially in nobility, and we will come to why it was. But this was something, and it wasn't that much of a taboo back then. Now it is, because we have evolved as a society. Another one is cannibalism, for example. We don't eat our own kind because animals in nature also don't eat their own kind unless they are very desperate. And uh, there was an interesting joke about that. So a British man is in a colony, is talking with a cannibal, and this is again in today it's something that hasn't aged well because of today's political correctness environment, but the point stands. So the man says, the cannibal says, well, you are killing people, and the man says yes, and the cannibal says, are you eating them? And the man says, oh heavens, no, why would we eat them? And then the cannibal says, well, if you are not going to eat them, why are you killing them? So what's the point? So this shows, for example, from another area that cannibalism is a taboo, but when you look at it the other way, the cannibal thinks, well, okay, it's okay for me to kill people and eat them, but you are killing them without eating them. Why are you doing that? That's another social idea, for example. Now, it has been 1 hour. We still have some way to go. So what should we do? Let's just go for a few more minutes, and then we'll give a break. It's a culture is, as I said, a timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly stuff. So it takes a lot of time to go through all the material. So at any point, if you are bored or if you really need to stop, signal me and I'll go faster. So in also in another part of the culture is the bias. So in culture, individuals may have biases towards each other or other cultures. So this can be cultural bias, because you think that culturally someone's actions or the way they live is not acceptable. This is cultural bias. So when you see someone from that cultural ethnic group or belonging, you immediately have an idea about them without knowing them as an individual. This is something we see in the world every day. And there is a caste system, for example. In India, there's a caste system, and someone belongs to another caste. Their relationship to you is already predetermined. The person's economic status, educational status, or gender can all be subject to bias, and we see all of these all around us all the time, especially in our cultural geographical location. And then we have the deviation from the norms. So what happens when someone deviates from these norms? So when you have a norm, you have a foray that you don't kill anyone, and someone kills someone, does it require punishment or does it not require punishment? So for example, there's a very nice example about this. We will go into this in values as well, but in the Trakya region of Turkey and going into Balkans, in ancient time, old times, culturally theft was not wrong, theft was not a crime, but being caught was a crime. So if you steal something, good for you. If you get caught, you're going to get punished. So when someone, for example, a boy steals a chicken and the neighbor catches that boy and brings him to his father, the father beats the boy or punishes the boy not for stealing the chicken but for being caught. That is a very interesting cultural motif, for example. So, what requires punishment and what does not require punishment can define the society as well. And when we say memes, we don't say it in the popular sense because meme is actually means it is, I think, popularized by Charles Darwin. It's a fragment of culture that can spread and have a meaning of its own. Now, when you see the definition, the word meme that we have in our world today, from here, know your meme, this actually has makes a lot of sense because there are lots of memes here, by the way, and I didn't prepare any ones to show you, but these are, for example, let's see this one. I don't know. I actually I won't go into it because there are some not suitable for work stuff in here all the time. But I just showed you the website. So when you go into memes in today's world, you have something, and generally it's about a picture and text, but you have some piece of information, very easily digestible, very small piece of culture, and then it evolves into another meme, and another meme comes up and creates another meme, and then to understand this one, you have to know three different layers of memes and their variants and know other stuff so that it leads to here. So you laugh at this and your mom just looks blank, for example. And you cannot even explain this to her because you cannot explain all of this to her, the 10 years of internet background required to explain this. So this also shows us how art is the memory of a culture because this final meme that you see on Instagram and laugh or on the internet contains 10 years of information and several numbers of memes combined into it, and you understand that context and you laugh at it and you take it as information. That is actually, from our society's perspective, a very strong way to transmit information. Because, for example, one of my favorites, this it's very difficult to find it now, so I do it. You must have seen it from there's a chopper show, and there's a father and son, and they exchange. They have an argument, and one of them throws a chair to the other at the end. I don't know what the name of the meme is, so I cannot look it up right now. But for example, this can have very different meanings of context and very hilarious exchanges. For example, I first saw this in a Star Wars meme. So they were talking about why Obi-Wan couldn't sense Anakin went to the dark side by throwing chairs at each other or arguing. But for this to be funny for you, you have to know what this represents as two people fighting as father and son, and then you have to know about Star Wars, and you have to know how that kind of debate has been going on in the world and how it reflects here, for example. That is layer and layer and layer of information, of culture to ingest. So let me again check my notes here. Then we have, just bear with me for a few more minutes. We have the rewards and punishments, the consequences of our actions. Now, the reward can be the appreciation of the society, having some form of recognition, people saying you are a good person or you are worthy, something, for example. Or you can have a real promotion in your work, in the army, or in anything. You can have a token, a symbol, a tangible token, for example, an Oscar or a military medal or a mark of honor, for example. Or you can have a material reward in form of resources and money. In punishment, it is basically, for example, the first is humiliation. You do something uh, unwanted in the society and people turn on you and say, and even that is a punishment in itself. It reinforces your behavior in some sort of way. Rewards, positively reinforce the behavior, and punishment negatively reinforces the behavior, very much the way it does in animals, since we are animals still. Now, banishment is, for example, also seen in animals, but it is more common in human societies. You just cast that person out because you don't want them. That person doesn't fit in the society, and you just send them away. There can be material punishment. You may make them pay an amount of resources. For example, in ancient societies, since there were no prisons back at that time, generally the punishment for killing someone was paying the family some sort of resources because they lost a resource, they lost manpower, and you have to compensate them, for example. Now, imprisonment is a modern day punishment, for example, for lots of crimes, and of course, execution. We don't want this person, but we don't want him or her to be around either, so we remove them from the equation entirely. And this is also a very popular way of punishment in the ancient world. Thankfully, not anymore. So we have rewards and punishments, and we have values. So we have values for the community, and we have values for individuals. So, for example, some values that the community might have is the sense of belonging. You belong to a community. You belong to a football clan, for example. You are a fan of a football team, or you belong to a social group. You consider yourself a geek, for example. You belong to the geek community, as it's a belonging. And having respect as a community, respect for the community and as a community. And of course, when we talk about societies, it's liberty. Being free, having freedom is important for communities. Now, for individuals, of course, sorry, yes, please. It is, of course, but uh, I mean it in in the sense that it is of these are all values that the individual has to individual perceives, but it is also the community creates its own sense of belonging within itself. It is the hive mind that we talk about. So the community is not a living thing in itself, but it acts like one. In that sense, of course, the individual cares about the sense of belonging in the community. Individual cares about the respect of the community, and individual cares about the liberty of its community. We fight independence wars for that. So these are all about, unless we are talking about a hive mind like bees or the geth, as I spoke about earlier, these are all the values of the individual perceiving themselves or the community. That's what I mean. Uh, so, for example, yes, 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 exactly. So, when I say community, I mean the group of people, group of individuals. But since it is the group of individuals that create the culture, it is a two. It also means both the culturally, and it is the people that make the culture live. So they are bundled together, so to speak. Okay. And of course, for individuals, the sense of individuality is very important, and the personal freedom is important. These are the values as well. Uh, so other values that we can have in our culture is justice can be valuable. For example, responsibility, honesty, friendship. By the way, these are not patterns. These are what we have in our world. So we can, for example, in a Klingon society, honor sits at the top of this list. So it is also, I didn't include it in here. In human cultures, honor is also important. But these are just examples. So we have to think about what our species might value in their society. Friendship, self control, patience, empathy, respect. These are all things that we see as valuable in our culture. So, uh, before going into a break, I will just go through a small, well, where is it? It is here. This is a slide that I didn't make, but I found, and it is valuable. For example, in American values, we see equality, individuality, And if you work hard and play hard, you are successful. You can do anything. The sky is the limit. And freedom, freedom, freedom. They talk so much about freedom. Mobility, for example, you see this in their sense of owning cars as opposed to communal transportation. Safety in their guns or so such things. Competition is very important for Americans, and efficiency. They try to make everything efficient. Now in Japanese, we see an obligation to the group. So each individual actually has to contribute to the group and foremost to the group so that the group can survive. Where did this come from? Japanese is a land that has lots of tsunamis, earthquakes, lots of natural disasters. And if Japanese people didn't stick together, they wouldn't have survived. And this created the sense of collectivism. The group must survive from the city must survive as a Frostpunk. But harsh conditions decrease the importance of individual and brings the community further into the spotlight. So they have an obligation to the group. They are behaving according to their status. They are very clear-cut definitions of work, and they abide by that. Harmony, again, being in harmony with the group, putting in effort, self-improvement, and self-criticism and collectivism. But in European values, for example, we have appreciation for aesthetics, intellectualism, and again, the socialism. There is a social structure European that Americans don't have, but this socialism is not as strong as the collectivism of Japanese. So, for example, European generally has free healthcare, free education. The US is very much lack on that respect, and in Japanese, they have very much stricter rules regarding schools, for example. In tradition, leisure, for example, sensuality, family, and friendship. And we can all bundle this. But for example, there's a good, interesting example here. The cultural values and slogans. I can share this with you as well. This is, I think, a slide that some students prepared, but it makes rounds around the internet and it's very useful. It's very well prepared. For example, I want to show you this one. Where is it? Here. These are two websites of the Ford Motor Company. This is for Europe and this is for America. And you see what they emphasize in here. In here you emphasize a smaller car because they are very much more resource aware and family oriented. But this one is power and about majesty and stuff. Or for example, London streets versus American streets. London is a very old town and most of its roads are made for carriages, horse carriages. So, and town city still stands, so the roads are very narrow. But the America was built on very wide open land, so they have that kind of a culture, open highways, and thus they have big cars, bigger everything. And this is the fourth page for Japan, for example. And this is the Japanese are very well different than us in terms of web design. So these are, for example, different things how culture manifests itself. And the final slide before the break. Oh, I actually we went about this. No, we went about this. I just included rituals. Rituals are very important, and we will actually talk about that in further lectures in further weeks, next other weeks. But rituals are it's actually a course in it can be a course in itself, the world rituals. But the rituals that the culture embodies is very important in definition. So they might be wedding rituals, they might be rites of initiation, there might be other rituals. For example, the Japanese have tea rituals. They have a ritual for making proper tea. As I said, they are all about efficiency and they try to find the elegance in that efficiency. So or they have rituals, for example, to begin sword practice. So before they begin the practice, they do a ritual and they prepare themselves mentally. But they also prepare themselves mentally when they prepare tea. And you would just think it's just tea, I'll pour it and I'll drink it. But they turn it into a mental ritual, and this in turn creates, for example, something very elegant to watch. You can watch it as an artistic performance, a tea ritual from Japan, for example. Okay, we have covered a lot of material. Again, we don't have that much material to cover in the second half of the lecture, but I came up to this point so that we can the structure. Uh, I will stop my screen share now and let's pause. Okay, so